I told myself I was being silly when I opened his message and saw only 3 words: flight delayed. Home later. It was the same casual note he sent when meetings ran long or when he wanted me to adjust dinner plans. Julian had a talent for making the inconvenience sound banal. My name is Ava Reed, and for 10 years our life had been a pattern of rehearsed apologies and polished after-dinners. Him, the busy husband with a calendar like a ledger; me, the partner who kept the household running on the edges of his time. That morning I packed a small bag anyway. Out of habit, because trust is a muscle and sometimes it needs the exercise of ritual to stay strong. I locked the front door and drove, the sky broad and white above the highway, and when the GPS told me to turn right toward the coast I almost obeyed without thinking. After all, who goes to the beach on a weekday unless an errand or an odd job calls? But the voice in my head that had been growing over the past months, the one that noticed details he thought I missed, insisted. Check him in, it said. Call the hotel concierge. Make sure. So I pulled over in a small lay-by, thumbed the screen, and typed the address into the car's nav like I'd been balancing this marriage with a ledger: 1 check, 2 checks, then verification. The blue dot moved toward the little cluster of cottages that we called the beach house row, the place where our family had once eaten clams barefoot and watched storms throw themselves against the shore. The GPS voice said, "You have arrived," and I felt the air shift inside my chest like a door swinging open. I walked up the boardwalk, the sand cold under my shoes, and the beach house loomed with its familiar white siding and the porch swing that squeaked when the tide was loud. The windows were open and the curtains fluttered. Someone had left a glass on the railing. My palms left smudges on the paint as I climbed the steps. Through the lens of a sun-bright afternoon, I saw him, Julian, in a linen shirt too casual for a business trip, a woman at his side with hair like a dark flag, laughing at something he said. The laughter washed the world into slow motion for a second, a cruel, cinematic moment where the air tasted like salt and betrayal. I could have turned and left. I could have walked back to the car and let this be an anecdote he could later charm his way out of, but a new, icy thing had already formed in me, a refusal to be baffled by plausible explanations. I stood on that porch and listened, pretending I'd come for a misplaced hat, and what I heard was not a lover's whisper but a business litany. We move it through night transfers. The lease will be in the holding name. He'll fly out tonight. She'll be at the airport. The woman's voice was clipped, efficient, not the tremulous sound of an affair but the precise tone someone uses when transactions are being arranged. My head swam for a moment with the geometry of it. Night transfers, holding names, airport timing. This wasn't a tryst, it was logistics. Julian looked up then, smiled broadly as if surprised by a pageant, and said, "Ava? What a nice surprise." His smile had the practiced warmth of someone who'd been practicing being surprised on cue. The woman simply lowered her sunglasses and extended her hand like a signature. "Claire Harrow, from Meridian Investments." My breath narrowed. Meridian. The same word I'd heard in a joke he'd made at dinner about expanding horizons and never thought to note. I could feel the world recalibrating, the missed anniversaries, the odd late-night calendar entries, the sudden consultations that required him to be unreachable. I had assumed busy. I had assumed trust. I had not assumed this kind of careful architecture of absence plans contrived not to be caught. I could have been theatrical. I could have raised my voice and demanded answers like a woman in a movie, but theatrics feed tabloids and seldom rewrite ledgers. Instead, I smiled because my face can hold warmth even when the heart is sharpening. I asked the small questions that seem to be casual and are never casual. "How long are you here?" "Just a few hours," Claire said. "Julian's finalizing a partnership for the new property." "Oh," I said, measuring the word like glass. "I thought he was on a flight." Claire tilted her head like a map and said, "Change of plans. Better to review the contracts in person." Julian's hand found mine, an old reflex, and squeezed, an effort to anchor me to the scene of his choosing. His fingers were warm and familiar and guilty. I let the pressure remain while my brain clicked through alternatives, the way a locksmith tests keys. If they were doing a contract signing, why the staying house? Why a woman with investment credentials meeting him at a private property instead of the office? Why night transfers? Why do you schedule everything when you want to hide it? I asked one more question aloud, the sound casual. "Do you want some coffee? I can put on a pot." His smile faltered. "No, I'm fine." We're just about to head out. They left minutes later in a sedan, laughter modulated like a soundtrack, the woman's hand resting lightly on his thigh for an instant that was a punctuation mark. I watched them go and did not hurry after the car. Instead, I walked back into the house, into the rooms that held our history like fragile china, and I put my hand on the countertop where he had left his phone face down. The screen was dark, there was no notification to betray him. I slid it into my bag like a thief taking an artifact, and for the first time in years I performed an act that was not about being polite but about taking inventory. At home, behind the locked door, I pulled the phone out and opened his calendar entries that said "Call with Meridian at odd hours," an email thread with attachments labeled "Holding Company Draft" and, in his sent items, messages to an account with an offshore suffix that matched the phrase "night transfers" I heard on the porch. The geometry of intent tightened into outline. This was not merely an outside woman. It was a whole axis of intent designed to move assets while I was en route somewhere else. I could have burned his clothes, smashed his watch, called friends to scream the truth into the sky. Instead, I did the most unromantic thing possible. I began to document. I copied the emails, timestamped his calls using the phone's log, screenshot the calendar entries, and then, like someone building a house from the foundation up, I sent 3 terse messages. One to a lawyer I trusted, one to the accountant who still answered my texts after midnight, and one to the one housekeeper who had been with me before Julian's career accelerated, the woman who kept records like prayers. Each message was a little beacon. Watch this file, save this date, protect these invoices. I did not act out of fury. I acted with a ledger's patience. When they returned late that night, the house had slept without them, its rooms steady, indifferent. They were careful in the way people are when they have rehearsed being careless, kisses that tasted like rehearsal, laughter that had been perfected to sound unburdened. I made them coffee, asked about his day, and listened to the practiced version of events that would make sense to the neighbors. He spoke of delays, and last-minute meetings, and travel plans still on. I kept my face a polite mask. Under the table, my fingers tightened on the folder where I'd printed the email attachments. From the pantry came the small, steady sounds of a woman who knew how to hold storms, opening cans, setting plates, doing what women like me are taught to do so that other people can perform. That night, while they slept, I sat in the study with the phone between my palms and a map unfurling in my head. Meridian was not just a name, it was a node. Offshore accounts are not accidents, they are architectural decisions. I thought of the times he'd said, with a grin, "Trust me. I've got this," and I realized how many meanings the phrase had: confidence, dominance, erasure. I drew a line on the margin of my notebook and wrote one word next to it: evidence. It was small, practical, a new habit forming in the dark. Tomorrow I would begin to follow the map his GPS had revealed. Tonight I would pretend to sleep. Revenge, I was already learning, never begins with fireworks. It begins with facts. I drove home slow, like someone trying to memorize the route in case the map needed to be retraced later. The sun had already slid toward evening, and the house smelled like lemon oil and something faintly like guilt. Inside, I moved the way people who have practiced calm do, measured, ordinary motions that hide the work under them. I took his phone to my study, set it on the desk, and began to peel the day apart with the tools I'd learned to use. When a life needed inventory, screenshots, call logs, saved attachments. The Meridian thread unfurled into a list of contracts and account numbers, and one notation kept returning "night transfer." The phrase wasn't romantic, it was tactical. I copied everything into a secure drive, encrypted the files, and then I called 3 people I trusted without fanfare: Denise Torres, the lawyer who preferred hard copies to drama; Mateo, our old family accountant who'd kept my mother's tax files when fortunes were smaller and loyalties clearer; and Rosa, the housekeeper who had kept this house honest longer than Julian had been forgiven his self-made absences. Each arrived with a different kind of calm. Denise smelled faintly of bergamot, and walked in knowing the language of injunctions as if it were prayer. Mateo showed up with a battered laptop, and the kind of curiosity older accountants reserve for puzzles that smell like error. Rosa came with a pad of paper and a look that said she had already noticed what mattered, what was missing or moved. We sat down like conspirators without the thrill. Denise listened to the facts, then told me what to expect. You don't win by rage. You win by removing momentum. She explained a two-step legal posture preservation letters to third parties and an emergency petition to the bank to freeze any transfers connected to the Meridian files until signature authority could be validated. Matteo went through the accounting logs with a magnifier's patience, aligning Julian's timestamps with wires and vendor payments. He found something that made my chest go cold. A series of microtransactions over 3 weeks routed through an entity called Blackridge Management and then consolidated into a single overnight sweep to an offshore account. The sums were mapped like veins, small at first, then swollen into 5-figure arteries. "It's not just a mistress," Matteo said quietly. "It's a laundering of leverage." Rosa reached into the kitchen drawer and brought out a shoebox of old receipts I'd once tossed into a drawer and never looked at. There were hushed notes in the margins, restaurant bookings, contractor invoices with names I didn't recognize, the odd signature that looked like a shorthand Julian used for convenience. It felt obscene to find my life backgrounded by so many signatures that were not mine. That night Denise and I drafted preservation demands and a formal notice to Blackridge's counsel. We sent them by courier and by encrypted email so there could be no claim of ignorance. Then I called Mr. Duval, the man who had once lent me $50 for flour and later lent me courage. He was small-voiced and fierce in his loyalty. "Place a hold," I told him in few words. "Any outgoing transfers under our joint accounts, freeze them today." He didn't ask why. He did it before his second espresso. While the legal and banking gears began grinding, I kept working in the quiet. I asked Raj, our IT lead, to run a maintenance scan under the pretense of a scheduled audit. He sent me logs encrypted with a password only I and Denise shared. The logs showed remote accesses from Julian's tablet in odd windows: 2 to 13 a.m., 3 to 47 a.m., 4:18 a.m., times when he supposedly slept in hotels or pretended to be in conference rooms. The metadata showed uploads to servers registered to Blackridge. Each line was a wire connecting intent to action. I didn't call him. I didn't need to. Evidence builds its own pressure. Over the next 2 days the house shifted into a new hum. Staffers came to me quietly with pieces of information. One of the banquet managers had invoices sent directly to a Blackridge receivable. The pastry chef said a bulk flour shipment had been rerouted with a different bill of lading. Each small confession felt like a tile falling into place. I offered jobs to anyone who wanted to move, with me legalized, contracted, and compensated. No speeches, only contracts signed and benefits explained. People signed with relief. The rumor mill at the club churned, then hiccuped. Julian tried to manage optics. He posted photos of flights and conference rooms, smiling at cameras that no longer believed in only his frame. I let the cameras click. I let the paper print. Public spectacle is combustible but slow. I preferred the slow burn that dryly removes oxygen. Denise filed the preservation motion that stalled any asset movement tied to the Meridian project, and the bank placed a temporary hold on transfers flagged in our forensic log. Blackridge's counsel responded with a terse denial and a request for time to clarify the chain of authority. Their tone was neat, mine was surgical. Next, I secured a discreet investigator, someone who knew the dark geometry of shell companies and nominee directors. He produced a map that read like a horror in neutral tones: an LLC in Delaware, a nominee in Bermuda, an account in Geneva. But the investigator also found something else: small phone calls between a certain broker and a shell company that used an email address mirrored by one of Julian's assistant's aliases. Constellations of proof can be fragile. One missing star can ruin the picture, but the map was filling in. While the legal motions slowed the financial machinery, I turned outward to message. Not to the press. Not yet. To the board. I arranged a private review meeting and presented a single, damning statement. We have detected unauthorized transfers, forged signatures, and a plan to divert corporate assets, while Mrs. Vale is scheduled to be absent. I am requesting an immediate audit and temporary reassignment of external signatory authority. I wrapped the words in documents: Raj's logs, Matteo's reconciliations, the investigator's map. The board's reaction was not theatrical, it was practical. Men who had once smiled at Julian's charm now looked at the spreadsheets. Some were frightened by the legal exposure, others simply wanted stability. Their votes were the kind people cast when they protect their own capital. They voted to place Julian on administrative leave pending inquiry, and to grant me temporary operational oversight to ensure continuity. It was not revenge, it was structure aligning with truth. I did not gloat. I arranged for a quiet memo to staff that emphasized calm and continuity. I wanted the house to run like a place that had always been owned by clarity. That night Julian left a terse message on my phone, 2 lines about misunderstandings and work stress. I saved it. The house no longer seemed like the stage of his life. It was a machine I was learning to run. Evidence had removed his speed, the board had removed his stage. The woman from Meridian had been a node in a wider design. The design had been interrupted. I sat in my study with the investigator's map spread, like a city plan, and allowed myself a breath that tasted faintly like relief. Tomorrow Denise would file for a preliminary injunction to prevent any further asset transfers. The morning after that, we'd brief the press with a sober statement if necessary. But for now, I closed the folder and walked to the kitchen where Rosa had left me a cup of tea and a note. We remember. We keep. I sipped the tea and watched the house settle into a new quiet, one not of erasure but of being noticed. The trap that had been set for me was finding its teeth dulled. The unraveling was underway. Julian returned 3 days later, wearing the same smirk he'd used to charm investors and apologize for missed anniversaries. The moment he stepped through the door, I knew he still believed the illusion was intact, that I was the sentimental constant who would absorb explanations like perfume into linen. He set his suitcase down in the foyer, loosened his tie, and said, "You wouldn't believe the flight delays." His voice was light, conversational. He didn't notice that the house had already shifted its loyalty. Rosa didn't greet him. The staff who once moved to his rhythm now paused, waiting for my nod before resuming. I gave none. I wanted silence to do the talking. He found me in the study, surrounded by stacks of ledgers and legal binders. "Ava, why are there lawyers here? You're making the staff nervous." His tone carried the blend of patronage and disbelief of a man who has never imagined being out of control. I looked up and said simply, "You should sit down." He laughed, not unkindly, because men like Julian always laugh before they fall. I slid a folder across the desk. Inside, screenshots, logs, notarized statements, bank reports. Meridian, Blackridge, Geneva. Each word landed like a bead on a string. We traced every transaction. We traced you. His face didn't redden or crack. Instead, his jaw worked once, then again. "You went through my accounts?" he asked, incredulous. "No," I said evenly. "I went through our accounts. The difference is ownership." He opened his mouth, but Denise stepped from the adjoining room. "Mr. Reed, you've been served notice of injunction and administrative leave. You're barred from accessing corporate systems or accounts until further notice." She handed him the official document, heavy paper, clean type. He stared at the seal like it might blink. "This is insane," he muttered. "You can't do this." Denise's voice was smooth. "Your signature on multiple unauthorized wire transfers says otherwise." He turned to me then, the calm slipping. "You had to make it this way, didn't you? Always turning things into performance." I tilted my head. Performance is pretending to be on a flight while standing in our beach house moving company funds offshore. The air between us solidified. He realized then that the usual tactics, deflection, charm, guilt, had no traction. I watched the machinery behind his eyes look for an exit. He tried a softer tone. "Ava, you're overreacting. The transfers were temporary. I was consolidating assets before the merger." I raised a hand. "I'm aware. You were consolidating them under a shell company in Geneva, whose controlling interest was listed under Claire Harrow." His eyes flickered. The name hit like a silent alarm. "This isn't what you think," he said finally. "It's bigger than that." "It usually is," I replied. Denise gathered her folders. "Mr. Reed, the board has scheduled an emergency meeting tomorrow morning. You can attend with counsel, but until then you're to vacate this residence and surrender any company property." He looked from her to me, waiting for me to intervene, for the softness that had always saved him. I offered none. "Don't make this ugly, Julian," I said. "It's already ugly enough." For a moment, I saw something unfamiliar in him, not anger, not guilt, but comprehension. The look of a man realizing that the woman across from him had stopped being his witness and become his reckoning. When he left, the silence that followed was surgical. Denise exhaled first. You handled that beautifully. I wasn't performing, I said. I was archiving. She smiled faintly. Same thing, in your world. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the binder open before me, cross-referencing every document one last time. It wasn't paranoia, it was protocol. Every sheet, every signature, every number had to align before the board meeting. Around midnight, Rosa entered quietly, setting down a plate of sliced fruit. You'll win, she said in Spanish, her voice gentle. He never thought you kept receipts. Morning arrived sharp and bright. The boardroom smelled of steel and espresso. Julian came flanked by his attorney, a slick man in a charcoal suit with too much cologne. They didn't greet anyone. The chairman, Mr. Duval, opened the meeting without ceremony. We're here to address allegations of financial misconduct involving executive leadership. Mrs. Reed, please proceed. I connected my laptop to the projector, my movements deliberate. I'll keep this brief. I began. Slide 1. Wire logs. Slide 2. Offshore transfers. Slide 3. Email correspondence between Julian and Claire Harrow coordinating the timeline of asset relocation. Every slide was quiet devastation. No voice raised, no music swelled. Just evidence stacking itself into a verdict. The final slide was a signature comparison, Julian's genuine against the forged authorizations used for the Blackridge transfers. The variance is statistically conclusive, I said simply. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Julian's lawyer cleared his throat. This presentation, while thorough, doesn't establish malicious intent. At most, it's procedural, Denise cut in, her voice sharp as glass. Mr. Vale's actions meet the criteria for fiduciary breach and fraudulent misrepresentation. We'll be filing with the Financial Crimes Division before close of business. Julian turned toward me, voice low. You'd really ruin me publicly. I'm not ruining you, I said. You did that when you mistook silence for loyalty. The chairman looked at me. Mrs. Reed, your recommendation? Immediate removal from executive position, asset freeze continuation, and formal cooperation with law enforcement, I replied. I'll assume interim control to stabilize operations. The vote took 2 minutes. Unanimous. Julian was escorted out before he could finish his half-smile. When the door closed, I didn't collapse. I didn't cry. I gathered the papers, thanked the board, and walked out into the sunlit corridor. Denise followed. It's over, she said softly. No, I corrected. It's documented. Outside, the city glittered as if nothing had changed. But I could feel the shift in the air, subtle. Like a key turning in a lock. For the first time in years, my name carried weight that wasn't borrowed. The journalists would find out soon enough. The shareholders would adjust. The staff would whisper. But I had done what few women in my position ever get to do. I had turned humiliation into a case study. That evening, I stood in the garden and watched the house lights come on. The pool reflected the sky's last blue. I thought of the beach house, of that afternoon when the truth first opened like a wound. I'd wanted to scream then, to burn it all down. But this calm, this finality was the better fire. Quiet, controlled, consuming everything that didn't belong. Tomorrow, the world would learn what Julian Reed had done. Tonight, I let the silence be my applause. The morning the papers ran, the headline cut like a clean blade. Executive. Removed in financial fraud scandal, Vale Hospitality, under new leadership. It was clinical, measured just the kind of language that carries the weight of fact without melodrama. I read it over coffee in the study, the steam fogging the page for a second like a private weather. People called with the expected mix of shock and congratulations. Some asked how I was holding up, as if that question could be answered with a single phrase. The truth was simpler. I felt procedural. Rage had its uses, fire to light the work, but it was evidence that had moved the world. Evidence never shouts. It persuades. Within 48 hours the regulators had opened inquiries, the bank confirmed the freezes, and the auditors arrived with briefcases and solemn expressions. Julian's lawyers filed motions and threats in neat envelopes, but the documents I had assembled were not rumor or rage. They were timelines and signatures and metadata that bore the hard clarity of daylight. The press wanted spectacle. They tried to frame it as a marital drama. I let them. Spectacle sells, but it does not unmake a wire trail. The cops asked questions that felt polite and precise, the kind meant to extract the mechanics of intent rather than the theatrics of betrayal. Julian refused to answer most of them. He insisted the transfers were strategic reallocations. His voice had the old cadence of someone who once owned an audience. That audience, however, had learned to read spreadsheets. Investors who had toasted him now asked for repayment schedules and collateral. Lenders who had smiled over cocktails now wanted indemnities and guarantees. The machinery he'd thought bulletproof had locks he hadn't noticed, and those locks were turning. I spent those weeks in a rhythm that felt oddly domestic: meetings, signatures, calls with counsel, walks through properties where staff greeted me like family rather than footnotes. I instituted emergency policies, transparent signatory chains, multiple approvals on transfers, mandatory third-party vetting for any offshore entity, so that no one could, in the future, wave a wand and make money disappear. It felt less like revenge and more like repair. One afternoon the DA's office called to say charges were being considered fraud, falsification, conspiracy to defraud. The words landed not like triumph but like necessary arithmetic: lies have consequences. When the summons arrived at Julian's temporary apartment in Zurich, served by a detective who had flown in with polite efficiency, he called me once. "You've made this personal," he said, voice thin. "You didn't have to make it public." "I didn't," I said. "You made it public by what you did." The case unfolded in courtrooms and boardrooms, in careful filings and public disclosures. Julian hired expensive counsel that argued nuance and intention and the murk where rich men try to hide. Denise and our legal team replied with timestamps and stamped deliveries, with witnesses who had once worked under his charm and now spoke with the bluntness of having been betrayed. The public watched with the bimodal interest they always show for fallen figures, satisfied schadenfreude tempered with a hunger for resolution. When the judge read the verdict guilty on multiple counts, it wasn't a roar so much as a legal exhalation. The sentence included restitution and barred Julian from holding any executive office in hospitality for a decade. It was not vengeance, it was consequence calibrated by law. The day Julian reported to a federal facility, cameras hovered like opportunistic insects. People asked if I felt good, if the verdict filled whatever emptiness he'd created. I felt something truer and quieter, relief that the machine of deceit had been shut down, and a solemn recognition of the people who had been hurt along the way: vendors with unpaid invoices, staff who'd been left with uncertainty, families whose jobs had trembled. I set about repair as if it were a moral ledger. I established restitution funds for vendors affected by late transfers. I accelerated back pay and bonuses for staff who'd covered extra shifts in the chaotic months. I created an internal whistleblower line and made it anonymous and independent. The first time a frightened voice called in, I answered it myself and scheduled a meeting with the person within 24 hours. The company changed in ways Julian's power never allowed: pay transparency, mandatory ethics training, a governance board that included staff representatives. In interviews I spoke about systems rather than scandal, about how hospitality can be dignity in action or a house of cards. That shift in language mattered. While legal processes ground on, the operational side of the business thrived under the clarity I enforced. Occupancy rose as reputation healed. Guests returned because the places were run by people who could explain how money moved and why it mattered. A new era began with small, precise rituals: checklists reviewed aloud at morning briefings, receipts photographed and archived in real time, two-person sign-offs for any transfer above a threshold. Empowerment breeds vigilance. One bright morning I stood in the lobby where Julian once took center stage and watched a young concierge, new, eager, and utterly unversed in the old equations, greet a guest and call a shuttle with the same graceful confidence he might have once used to charm an investor. I felt something like triumph then, not because the man who'd lied was gone, but because the culture he'd poisoned had been healed. The press lingered on the detail that I'd kept his surname across our hotels. Some critics called it cruel, others called it strategic. I called it practical. The name Vale had market value recognition that could be repurposed toward dignity. We reframed it, the Vale Foundation for Hospitality Ethics, a fund seeded by confiscated assets and corporate donations, now supported training for underrepresented workers in the industry and grants for small local vendors to stabilize cash flow. Each plaque, each sponsorship, each grant rewired what the name meant. In our flagship lobby, I hung a small bronze plate honoring the housekeeping teams for the hands that make hospitality possible. Under it, a photograph of my abuela hung with simple pride. The plaque read, "Work is dignity, dignity is our first currency." That inscription was not spectacle. It was a policy. Months later, when the auditors closed their final reports and the last of the legal entanglements settled, Solis Vale stood financially stronger and more humane. We had repaired balance sheets, reclaimed assets, and rebuilt trust. The brand carried his name but in the hands of people he had once diminished. I walked each property frequently, unannounced, in sensible shoes, talking to bartenders and bellhops and pastry cooks. "How are the hours?" I'd ask. "Do you feel safe?" Their answers informed policy, and their gratitude was quiet and real. For myself, the aftermath was less about headlines and more about language. I stopped introducing myself as Julian's wife and started saying, simply, "Ava Reed, CEO." It felt like a small reclamation that rippled outward. One evening, months after the verdict, I drove back to the beach house that had been the accidental reveal of everything. The porch was painted a color we chose together, sea foam green, and the swing creaked in the breeze the way it always had. I walked onto the boardwalk and looked at the horizon, where waves erased footprints without judgment. There was no thrill in seeing the place where he'd thought to hide a meeting. The thrill had been in the work that followed, in the ledger balanced and the systems mended. I took out my passport, the one I'd locked in the glove box that afternoon, and ran my thumb across its edge. The GPS had led me to a revelation. It had also handed me the route to accountability. I thought of all the tiny checks and quiet recordings I'd made, notes in margins, emails saved, receipts scanned, and felt a gratitude that surprised me. Gratitude for the habit of paying attention. The world is noisy and full of plausible stories designed to comfort those who profit from them. My choice had been to listen for the parts that didn't fit, to treat them like the loose thread that, when pulled, unravels a lie. When I left the beach house, I didn't close the door as a woman who had won a fight. I closed it as a steward who had learned how to guard what matters so it wouldn't be taken again. The sun fell in thick gold behind me, and the sign above the hotel entrance glinted. Vale Hotels, a name reclaimed, a system rebuilt, a promise rewritten.